15,000 users just saw a blank white screen for 45 minutes. A single null reference in a sidebar server component crashed the entire dashboard because there was no error, TSX, to catch it. The article targets Next.js 16, but the error handling conventions error, TSX, not found, TSX, global-error.tsx work identically in Next.js 15 app router. The main difference is that in Next.js 15, params is not a promise, you access it directly as params ID. If you're on Next.js 15, remove the await params pattern shown in the article. The article mentions using React error boundary, but doesn't show a custom class-based error boundary. Here's a self-contained error boundary component that works without any external library, using React's component did-catch lifecycle. The article warns against using try-catch as a replacement for error boundaries. A practical rule: use try-catch in server components around data fetching to handle expected failures, e.g., network errors, and return fallback data. Use error boundaries to catch unexpected rendering errors. Never try-catch a rendering operation, that's what error boundaries are for. In Next.js 16 with streaming, using loading, TSX or suspense, an error in a streamed server component may not be caught by the root-level error, TSX, if the error occurs after the initial shell is sent. The error boundary only catches errors during the initial render. For streamed content, wrap each streamed section in its own error boundary to ensure errors are caught. Let's break down error handling in Next.js 16. Error, JS, not found, JS, and global errors, how it works, and the exact mistake behind that failure. In this guide, we'll build a comprehensive error handling strategy for Next.js 16. Granular error boundaries, custom 404 pages, a global error boundary for catastrophic failures, and logging instrumentation that catches errors before they crash your users' sessions. Next.js Error Handling is a set of file conventions and React patterns for gracefully handling runtime errors in server and client components. Error, TSX creates a React error boundary that catches rendering errors at the root segment level, showing a fallback UI instead of a blank page. Not found, TSX handles 404 scenarios. Global error, TSX is the outermost error boundary that catches errors in the root layout. Error, TSX is a client component file that, when placed in a root segment directory, creates a React error boundary that wraps the page and its children. When any component throws during rendering, React catches it and renders the error, TSX component instead. The component receives two props, error and reset. You must include useClient at the top. Here's a typical error, TSX for a dashboard root. It logs the error, shows a friendly message, and provides a try again button that calls reset to re-render the segment. Without this file, an Uncaught error produces a blank white screen. Error, TSX must be a client component with useClient. Without it, React's runtime error boundary mechanism isn't available and the file won't catch errors. I've seen teams spend hours debugging why their error, TSX, doesn't work. It's because they didn't add the directive. A single error, TSX, at the root level still replaces the entire page content. For pages with multiple independent sections, wrap each section in its own error boundary. This way, if the sidebar crashes, only the sidebar shows an error state. The main content and footer continue working. Here's a reusable section error boundary component. It uses React's class component error boundary methods. Wrap each independent section with this component, providing a fallback UI. A broken sidebar shouldn't crash the main content. Next.js's default 404 page is plain text on white. Not found, TSX lets you create a branded, helpful 404 page that guides users back to working content. It's triggered when Next.js can't match a root or when your code calls not found from Next navigation. Here's a root not found, TSX, and how to use not found in a server component. When data doesn't exist, call not found for a controlled navigation to your custom 404 page. It's cleaner than try-catch and shows your branded fallback. The root layout wraps your entire application. If an error occurs in the root layout itself, root-level error TSX files won't help. Global error, TSX, is the answer. It must be placed at app/global-error, TSX must use useClient and replaces the entire application shell when the root layout crashes. Because global-error.tsx replaces the root layout, you must include HTML and body tags. It doesn't inherit any styles or fonts from the layout. Keep it minimal, just a branded crash page with a reload button. Keep the root layout as thin as possible. If it throws, you need global-error.tsx, which is a self-contained page without styles. Minimize logic in the root layout to reduce crash risk. The biggest problem with error.tsx is that errors become invisible to you. A user sees something went wrong and maybe clicks try again. If it works, you never know an error occurred. This is why every error.tsx must log the error to a monitoring service like Sentry. Here's an error.tsx that logs to Sentry with context, the root path name and section name. Something went wrong on dashboard is useless. Report section crashed for user 42 on dashboard reports is actionable. Errors in server components are caught during server-side rendering. The error is serialized and sent to the client's error.tsx boundary. Server errors never reach the browser console because they happen on the server. This makes them especially dangerous. A crashing server component silently produces a blank page that you can't debug from DevTools. Server component errors never show in the browser console. If you see a blank page with no console errors, look at server logs. Client component errors appear in the browser console and are easier to debug. Errors in layouts are tricky. A layout wraps all its child pages, so an error in the layout affects every page under that root. The solution? Add error.tsx at the same level as the layout. If the root layout throws, you need global-error.tsx. Add error.tsx at every level that has a layout.tsx. A layout error without a sibling error.tsx crashes all pages under that root. Every layout needs a sibling error.tsx. Root layout needs global-error.tsx. The reset function in error.tsx attempts to re-render the segment. It's not a page reload, it calls React's error boundary recovery. For persistent errors, reset will fail again. Implement retry logic with exponential backoff or auto-retry with a timeout. Use set timeout equals reset 3000 in error.tsx for likely transient errors. Combine with a count to avoid infinite retry loops. If auto-retry fails, show a manual retry button. Error boundaries are hard to test because they're triggered by exceptions. Test them in development by intentionally throwing errors in your components. Create a dev-only page that throws an error to verify your error.tsx renders correctly. Visit Debug Error Test in development to confirm error. TSX shows with correct styling and reset button. Then, check Sentry for the captured error. An error boundary that doesn't render correctly during an error is worse than no boundary at all. Here's the production error handling stack. Global error, TSX at the root catches layout crashes. Not found, TSX at the root catches unmatched roots. Each root segment with data fetches has error, TSX with Sentry logging. Each page with independent sections has granular error boundary wrappers. Keep the root layout minimal to reduce crash risk. The file structure shows the layered approach: global error, TSX layout error, TSX root error, TSX granular error boundaries, all instrumented with logging. A try-catch that swallows an error and returns null shifts the problem downstream. Something else will crash on null and the original error is lost. Don't use try-catch as a replacement for error boundaries. Error boundaries catch rendering errors, try-catch catches data errors. Use both but keep them separate. Error boundaries and suspense boundaries can nest inside each other. Best practice: wrap each suspense boundary in its own error boundary. This pattern isolates both loading states and error states per section. Here's a reusable suspense error wrapper that combines an error boundary and suspense. Suspense handles loading. Error boundary handles failures. Wrap each independent section in both for full isolation. This is the same issue we highlighted at the start. Here's exactly why that happened. A server component in the sidebar tried to access user preferences theme, where preferences was null for users who had never opened settings. React's error boundary on the server caught this during rendering, and because there was no error, JS, React unmounted the entire RSC tree, sending an empty shell to the client. 15,000 users saw a white screen for 45 minutes. The root cause was accessing user preferences theme when preferences was null, causing a type error. The fix added optional chaining to safely access nested properties. The fix was twofold. First, added error, TSX at app dashboard to catch the error and show a degraded dashboard without the sidebar. Second, fixed the null access with optional chaining, user preferences, theme, added Sentry instrumentation to log all server component errors. Now, if a similar error occurs, the dashboard shows a fallback UI and the team gets alerted. This is the exact line that caused the production incident. User preferences was null for users who had never opened settings. Always use optional chaining when accessing deeply nested properties. It's not optional, it's a safety net. Here's a quick debug guide. First, check if the root has an error, TSX file. Then verify it has the use client directive. For blank screens with no console errors, check server logs. Use Sentry to capture and view errors with context. Let's run through some common interview questions. Explain the 3 error handling file conventions: error, JS, not found, JS, global-error, JS with specific use cases. Why does error, TSX need to be a client component? Error boundaries require React runtime. Server components can't catch runtime errors. How to handle errors in layouts? Add error, TSX at same level. Root layout needs global-error, TSX. And a few frequently asked questions. What's the difference between error, TSX and global-error, TSX? Error, TSX catches segment errors inside layout. Global-error, TSX catches root layout crashes outside layout. Can error, TSX catch layout errors? Yes, if placed at the same level as the layout except root layout. Does error, TSX need use client? Yes, it must be a client component. Let's recap the key takeaways. Always add error, TSX per root segment. Use granular error boundary for sections. Log errors with Sentry for visibility. Keep root layout minimal. Ready to go deeper? Up next, metadata and SEO in Next.js 16. From basics to dynamic OG images, then deploying Next.js 16. Versal, self-hosting, and static export, then dynamic routes, root groups, and advanced routing patterns, and parallel routes and intercepting routes in Next.js 16. Find them all at TheCodeForge.io. Thanks for watching. The full article and code examples are covered in detail at TheCodeForge.io.